Okay, hello, audience at Classical Archives. It's my great pleasure this morning to spend some time with Mike van der Nahmer, excuse me, who's a computer scientist, a composer, a SETI artist in residence, and I know it's going to be a conversation that will go where no man has ever gone before, as they say. So, because it's such a, you'll see when we start to talk. I've spent a few days getting to know online Mike's work, and I want to ask him whether I've kind of begun to understand what he does and what he studies in the realm of what he calls sonification, which I understand is kind of a simultaneous use of sound and video inputs. Um, and I would invite you to take it and try to explain what sonification means.
Yes, happy to do that. So you all know visualization, yeah? So which visualization is usually a form in which you use some kind of data, what can be any kind of data, and then we transform this into some kind of visuals. It can be a graphs, it can be some other images, but it usually helps us to understand the data. Yeah, so you usually, even if you just go on a family trip, and if you want the whole family to be included, you don't just maybe just say, let's just go to Italy. You might say, well, here are some ideas. We could go to Italy, we could go to Spain, we could go to France, and then you could paint it on a map, and then everyone in your family could see, okay, these are the options that we have, and then we can maybe pinpoint some ideas and so on. And so in the end, we have a visualization of the idea that you had. And I do the same thing with sound. So I'm thinking about a way of how can I get some kind of data. It can be a question, it can be some actual data that, for example, like in the air traffic control where I'm currently working, we have some flight data, a flight plan, some radar information, some input of where a plane comes from, an aircraft, where it goes to. And then I see for ways of how I can give certain parts within this information a sound that hopefully, that is always the best case, that hopefully will you help to understand the information that you're giving through the sound in a different way and hopefully in a helpful way. So you can, for example, another example is the Geiger counter, which you probably know very famously. That is one of the most famous sonification devices. So you have the atoms, and the more you have of them happening, the more you have of this sound. And so you directly are informed through the sound what is happening around you. And that is really a very, very simple sonification tool. And so everything else are additional ideas how you can use data and transform them into an acoustic environment that hopefully will guide you in a different way through the information. We often use that kind of process when there's, for example, a lot of information. So, for example, imagine your last trip maybe to a doctor, and they might have done an EKG, maybe a 24-hour EKG. And one of the earliest questions was for some doctors, for example, well, I have all of this information from 24 hours. Would there be a quicker way to actually go through the data? And maybe I just want to have 2 or 3 informations within this data actually important for me. So you could, for example, say, instead of looking and going through the entire 24-hour information of the data, you could say, oh, if the data looks like this from my heart, then it should make a beep sound. And so instead of looking at the data, you can just put it somewhere in your headphones. And whenever you hear a beep sound, you know, oh, now I actually have to look. And so it can help you focus. It can help you direct information differently. It can help you to understand connections within your data in different forms. And that is, longer sentence, the idea of sonification.
So you'd mentioned air traffic control, I think. So, well, this clearly can help people make decisions, like air traffic controllers be aware of problems and make better decisions, right? In a more timely way.
Yes, I mean, the first thing is, as you probably have seen sometimes in movies, if you look at the air traffic controllers, so there are usually huge halls of like 30 or 40 air traffic controllers sitting in a room. You usually have 2 working together, guiding the information from different sectors. sectors are the ones that, like the flight sector that you have been working in as an air traffic controller. And so when you look at the space in different forms, you can have different air traffic controllers work on different sectors. And so usually you have a lot of them working in a room. And so our idea, or what the department of the German Aerospace Center is currently developing, is asking the questions, okay, we have these air traffic controllers, could develop tools to first help them better in their process or differently in their process. But then it's also the quite tricky question is, how can we make it autonomous? So which actually means in the very end, which we have unfortunately or fortunately in many areas at the moment, for trains, for ships, for aircrafts, for cars, the question is to kind of, in an almost mean way, is how to get rid of the human, yeah, within this context. Yeah, you can basically say, that's the basic idea. But it's still far away from us, the idea of having completely autonomous air traffic control and piloting and everything. So I'm working on an idea that maybe will help us in 10 to 20 years, when the air traffic controller is basically sitting in a room like me or you. Yeah, we both sitting now in whatever space you feel comfortable where you are. And so you can direct aircraft from wherever you are. So you would just have your screens and you would sit there alone, and the computer, for example, would help you and tell you, you know, there is an emergency happening, or there's a conflict happening. Maybe you should redirect the aircraft in a different form. And for this scenario, when basically the air traffic controller is not really talking to the pilot anymore, which also means the acoustic channel is free. Yeah, which is again very important, because otherwise you would just be overwhelmed with all of the acoustic information that you're getting. So in that case, it's basically you and the computer. And for that case, where you basically have an operating task, you can use sonification, soundscapes, sounds in different forms, where kind of also the idea is that the sound might, as we call it, bring you back into the loop. For example, if you get bored because nothing is happening, or also if you're overwhelmed. Yeah, there might be too much happening and you don't know what's going on, so that you can communicate with the computer. And I'm just trying to build an acoustic system around that, in which the acoustics kind of help the air traffic controller of the future to communicate with the computer. You can almost see it like in Star Wars movie, when you have R2-D2, and then R2-D2 is talking and saying something, and then you can react to that. And I'm basically trying, in some form, you could say, I'm trying to find a voice for the computer, so that the air traffic controller can kind of communicate with the computer through the sound. And so, for example, some sound might say, and that might, for example, say, a new aircraft has arrived in your sector. Or it might be, or something else. And then you might say, oh, maybe there's a conflict happening. And so this would be the classical case of kind of what we have, like auditory warnings, which you can also find in cars. Yeah, like, for example, if you sit down in your car and you drive around and you go somewhere, some places, and suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, there's a sound coming from somewhere, and it basically says your gas is nowhere, you're out of gas, or get to the gas station very quickly. So this would be the traditional form of using auditory warnings, or auditory sounds, as we say. What I find most interesting in my current research, which is really quite differently and quite new in that realm, is that you can imagine the information of the aircrafts going through space, and I'm kind of trying to create a soundtrack for that. So that you're not just getting warning sounds when something happened, but that there's also the ability that it's really working like a soundtrack, meaning the music might already shift seconds or minutes before something bad might happen, because it might tell you, you know, sharks or Jaws. I mean, you can just use John Williams. Just imagine the dun, din, dun, din, dun, dun, is coming out of nowhere, and you're knowing, oh, if Jaws is coming, maybe I should put my attention there. And so that might be a very helpful tool, because sometimes if you're working with the computer, and I'm sure that you know this by yourself, you might lose some things, or you might forget about this aspect that you're working on, or you might need a different information. And sometimes it might be helpful, for example, just as a simple way that you, for example, getting a short auditory signal when an email has arrived. Yeah, and then you know, oh, should I check my emails? Oh, this is helpful. And that is something to keep you back into the loop through the acoustic channel and saying, hey, look at that. But then again, also in this kind of film score world where you have different ways of how I will hopefully give you a good soundtrack. And so as you can imagine, an air traffic controller usually sits for around 6 hours. Yeah, I mean, they have some breaks, but overall, so I have to create a soundscape that, yes, has some warning capabilities, but still has to be not annoying. Because if I annoy you, you will just turn me off. Because you will just say, you know, I can't listen to this for 6 hours. And so
Right.
I can't just do annoying sounds for you because it will just bother you. And so I have to figure out now how different degrees of complexity within the setting of air traffic control will work, but also how can I create an acoustic environment that you don't find hopefully annoying. Because if I do that, again, you will just say, Mike, that is a very nice idea. Maybe there are some good ideas that you have within this concept, but to be honest, it just annoys me. We have to stop this. So that's what I don't want. So I have to create a soundscape in which you almost have, like, again, like in a film score, an unconscious kind of feeling that I'm triggering something. Maybe I'm changing the beat slowly, yeah, from an ding dang ding dang to ding da ding da ding ding. So something is happening with underneath the music that is going on, and you suddenly realize, oh, Mike is shifting some of the sounds. That means I should look at this and this and this aspect. And so that is what I'm trying to create for many projects at the moment, to kind of going away from these short running sounds to a film scoring world of data. Yeah, that I think would describe hopefully best what I'm trying to achieve.
So this might be an unintelligent question, but we know that the spectrum of what the human eye can see omits, it's quite limited. And on the other hand, the aural, number of megahertz that the ear can hear is also limited. So by combining them, are you producing a greater net result in terms of what people can interact with?
Yes, and that is something that I find particularly important in my work, because in the past it was always a question, or many times a question, the eye is better than the ear, or the ear is better than the eye. And I don't find this question at all interesting or helpful. I'm really interested in this multimodal model, which means give me your senses. You have different senses. You can touch something, you can hear something, you can see something. And then let's see how we can combine them in a way that they actually help you. And so exactly as you said, I'm looking at the visual information that you already have, like with the product or with the software or with some other tools that you have developed. And then I will ask questions like, very, very basic questions. So for example, like, what does your technology actually mean for you emotionally? How would you describe it? How would you describe the technology that you have built? Or I would even ask questions like, do you have some character traits that you would give your software? Is it maybe stubborn, or is it in a way lazy or whatever? And so then I would kind of build like a character map from your software or from your tool even. And then I would even use this as a basic tool of understanding how can I give an additional information through the music and the sound. But it's really the interesting part is on the intersection of the visual information and the acoustic. Another part that you also mentioned is that, I mean, which we all know, so you're looking now at me, but you don't know what's happening besides the images that you have, but you don't know what's happening behind you. Yeah, so that's one of the key problems that we have with sight. So basically where you kind of focus your sight, that also means if I'm focusing in this direction, I will look at the thing that is happening here. And if I look at this direction, I will look at the things that are happening here. The good thing and the interesting thing about the ear, as you well know, is we can listen in 30, 60 degree around us. So we can even hear sounds behind us. We can hear sounds left and right and in front, which is very, very important because we need to know if something dangerous is happening behind us so that we can immediately react to it. And that is one of the other things that is very easy and understandable for the ears. And that can work, for example, again, if you think of like, I will see if I can find a simple way to show this. And hopefully the camera will catch it. So if you use this in a way, maybe you can see it a little bit. I will try to make it a little bigger.
Yeah, it was clear when you got it quite close to the camera.
Yeah. So if you use this, for example, as a sector, yeah, and describe it as a sector, then you can say an aircraft is coming from this direction or from the other direction or from here or from here. Yeah. And so that would be, for example, a very simple way of translating visual information into sound, where you can just say if an aircraft is coming from the left, then of course sound has to come from the left. If an aircraft is coming from the right, of course the sound has to come from the right. And that would be, for example, an easy way of combining information, so that, for example, you would see the aircraft, but then you would also immediately hear the sound, and then you would kind of know, oh, this aircraft now came from here. And so that is what I really find interesting, to connect the ideas that you have about your software, about your tool, about your question, the character traits that you had, how you would emotionally describe it. Because as you know, music is a very difficult thing. If I tell you, like for today, for example, you sent me an email and you said we will meet at this and this time over Zoom and we will discuss things. We both know through the language what's going to happen. If I send you a piece of music and just say, here's the information, and then you will say, I don't know, Mike. I'm sorry, but it's nice, maybe I like the music, but it doesn't tell me anything. And that's the problem of the music, that music doesn't translate information that way, but music can trigger and translate information in an emotional way, as you know, for movies. Yeah. So if you have usually a sad scene, then the music can also help you to understand what's going on. Or if you want to help an audience in general understand how do you want a scene to be experienced, I can say through the music if it's sad or funny, if it's dark, whatever. Yeah. So the music has the power of taking you somewhere emotionally and triggering you emotionally, while the visual information can just give you the kind of clear data. And that's what I find interesting. But you can also add other things. You can also, of course, which we have on phones and other devices, touch. That something is vibrating, yeah, or something that is just telling you different emotion through that. And so there are many ways that I find the more we connect our senses, the better I think it is for us in the long run to work and deal and interact with technology. Yeah, because then I can actually, I feel that something is there. Otherwise, we just have this feeling of there's this empty space, but what I'm going to do with that is still, I can't, yeah, if it's vibrating, I already know, oh, it's strong vibrating or it's weaker vibrating. But again, it's a question of how do we connect all of our senses to get hopeful, helpful information.
It's funny. It makes me think that when our daughter was very little, we took her to Disney World in Florida, which I'm not the world's biggest fan of Disney just generally, but I remember we went to a movie and the chair you were sitting in would jump up and down and they would spray water on you. And then there was a moment when there were supposed to be rats running through the auditorium and they had rat tail under the chair that would suddenly start to spin around.
Yes.
So it's funny. It's just sound, vision, and sensory together really got us jumping.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, you can even take this further now. Imagine, and we can even almost take this now in the way of the mind. Imagine that you're really losing one of these sentences, and then you can really experience how someone, for example, with a hearing disability or with blindness or even with problems in touch, they need to make sense of the world in different ways. And so not just for blind people, but it's also helpful for blind people to have a way where they can see data or information, not just visual, because that will not help them, but where they can actually hear them. And so they currently, I think they have a department even at NASA where they're exploring ideas to really translate data into acoustic information so that blind scientists can also work with them differently. Yeah, and so that's just very cool that we suddenly have all of these different elements. And again, it's not about saying one is better than the other. It's really how can we include a lot of different people in science, and how can we create opportunities? How can we use science in a, yeah, I would almost say in a human way, in a human approach, to make it more human, because otherwise it's just us against the technology. And I think also coming to the question that we have, like with the bots that are happening everywhere now in the world, and people are getting very interested in, where there's always the fear, will the bots and the computer technology overtake the world? Which I don't think is a helpful question or thought. I find it much more interesting if you would say, by ask the question, how can we communicate and, yeah, kind of direct our information with a bot or with the computer and brainstorm ideas, for example, or try different things that we usually would need a big team. Like imagine that, for example, visual information could be easily transported already, which there are some softwares where you can put in some short prompts, and then it will show you some visual information. For example, you can say, paint me a red triangle on top of the mountain. Yeah, and then the IE will kind of create that image. Usually you would need to be either an artist yourself, or you would need to hire artists. And the interesting part that I find, and even for the music, is you can now communicate with the computer, and you can ask questions, and you can like start to bounce off ideas. And then you take these ideas, and then, for example, you can translate them into a big image of a mountain and these things, or other kinds of information. I think that's much more helpful, I find, how we can direct our ideas or intersect our ideas or intercommunicate with technology in these, yeah, sensory information ways.
So what future applications do you think there will be for sonification of in AI? And we were talking about air traffic control, and I think we also touched on self-driving cars and things. But what other applications do you see coming down the turnpike at us?
I think what I'm hearing now more and more from the teams that I'm working with is really the question of that I'm literally asked, Mike, can you make the computer thinking process audible? Is there a way that we can actually hear, almost in an emotional way, that we can hear what the computer is doing? Is the computer overwhelmed? Is the computer kind of bored? Would it need more information? And so on and so on. And I think that is actually really interesting, because that's, I think, questions that maybe we have seen in movies where we have the ideas of what the computer might do. But I think that is something where sonification could be really, really helpful to actually get an acoustic feedback from the computer that says, you know, at the moment, I'm still working on this, hold on. Because sometimes you don't see what's happening. Yeah, you just stay there and the computer is doing something. But sometimes I think, at least I'm unsure, is the computer doing something?
Yeah.
Is the software hanging? Are you still working? And so if there's an acoustic feedback that might just tell you, hey, I'm still here, just wait, just give me a couple of moments. And then you can, for example, know this. And then I think for the sonification in general, I think we're really just in the very beginning of exploring all of the things that we could do with that, so especially for autonomous driving, yeah, which is still something that is really part of the future. But imagine yourself a very simple scenario. So imagine us in 10, 20 years when we really have autonomous driving. So, for example, you're going there and we say we will meet somewhere in New York, and you call the car for you. And then you stand with your phone and you're waiting for the phone. And as you know, there are busy streets in New York. Sometimes you don't know where the cars are coming. And then, for example, your phone could send you an acoustic information saying, hey, your car has just arrived. Then the next thing would be, it could show you also visual where the car might be, but it can also guide you acoustically to your car. Then the car could kind of welcome you once it's recognizing you. For example, you could have said, every time I interact with an autonomous car, I want that it plays the Star Wars theme by John Williams. And then, for example, you are greeted emotionally and personally, acoustically by the car. Then you sit down in the car, and then suddenly the whole acoustic atmosphere changes, because you have taught the computer, every time I step into a car of an autonomous driving, I want that there is rainforest sound. And I want to hear this and this kind of rainforest sound. And so immediately there would be an atmosphere created for you in that space. And then you can also, for example, say, if there's additional information that I get from the car, then maybe use these kinds of sounds within that. And so as you can just see by this very easy and simple example, there's already a lot of things that are happening. Another aspect would be also, imagine again a world where we have a lot of cars driving, and that usually at the moment it means that they have these kind of light bars around them. Yeah, so I don't know if you've seen them, but we're actually working also on projects here at the German Aerospace Center. So it's basically a car, and on the left and on the right, it has these almost lightsaber qualities, which is like a bluish color. And so the kind of color circle informs you as, for example, as a walking person, is the car recognizing you? Because you could say, if it's a self-driving car, you don't know, did the car see you? Did it not see you? Is the car aware of you? And so we have also to think about these things. So for example, one of the things that they are doing for autonomous cars is that these kind of light kind of bulks would follow you. So that, for example, if you stand in front of a car, then the light on the car would follow if you walk more to the left or would walk more to the right, so that you as a walking person would also know, oh, it actually recognized me. It knows where I am. Then there's other things like if the light is not blinking, then it means something else. But then when the light is going to blink, it could mean another information. But now you can also put additional acoustic information on that. Yeah, so you could, for example, say, if there's a warning impulse, let's say you're walking on the street again, and you're somewhere in your thoughts, and you're completely forgetting that there are cars around you for whatever reason. And then maybe you come too close to a car, the car itself might warn you, hey, be careful, you're coming too close to the street. Yeah, so you have all kinds of possible ways. You have, as we said, you have the way of over a phone directly talking to the car. Then you have the atmosphere within the car. Then you have data and signals informing you within the car of things that are happening. Then you have the communication from the car with the outside world communicating. So you have a ton of information that you can do. And as autonomous driving, it will be in everything. It will be for ships. It will be for cars. It will be for aircrafts. It will be for trains. It's very important that you also inform, just sometimes when you're not aware of things, that there's some kind of acoustic feedback. So sonification, I think, can be very, very helpful in that world.
Well, it's really fascinating. What is the I know you're also a SETI artist in residence. So how does this study tie into the mission and work of the SETI Institute?
What I found so interesting about SETI is, and why I was just so happy to become part of the SETI family, was that I have been, in my entire life, I have been interested in how does life exist in general? What is a different kind of species? What is a different kind of life form? So I'm not even talking about ET at the moment. I'm even talking just about the basic concepts of human-animal communication, for example. Yeah, let's say you want to understand how your dogs communicate, or how your cat communicate, or how birds communicate. But then also, what is life in a broader sense? What does it mean? How can we relate to ourselves within this huge cosmos of thoughts and of different ways? And that's something that I'm doing at the SETI. So I'm trying to explore ideas which I call the thinking universe, which is less the ET way of exploring it, but it's more my interest. If you look at the cosmos in a broader way, for me at least, it looks similar to a brain. Yeah, you can almost say that you have different star systems and you have different other things and you have light. But if you just look at it from the outside, it almost looks like it's similar to our mind itself. And so it's almost sometimes feels to me that our mind is connected with the entire cosmos. And that's why I call it the thinking universe, because I'm curious about if there is some scientific background or knowledge how the universe in itself actually communicates. Do stars communicate with each other? Is there something happening how they regulate each other? Are there different ways? Are there different ways how we can connect the ideas of our mind and the universe? And that's what I'm doing at the SETI Institute. We're exploring these questions with different scientists, and yeah, and following my instincts to see what it might lead as well.
Yeah, I've never heard the universe described as a kind of a brain before. That's really fascinating. It's funny. I've always been convinced, and this is an aside, that the greatest mystery of all is how human intelligence differentiated from other animals and where that came from. And maybe that came from outer space. There's a book by Terence McKenna called Food of the Gods that I don't know whether you know his writing, but he posits that human intelligence came down from the stars in the form of spores that grew on the earth, and then people ate them. And so basically, because humans had social structures that enabled them or encouraged them to eat hallucinogenic mushrooms that they basically absorbed in alien consciousness. So I don't know if I believe that or not, but at least it's an attempt to understand why chimpanzees don't think the way humans do, you know?
Yes. And I mean, it even connects with some of the ideas of Ziggy Jung, the collective unconsciousness, that we all have knowledge that we share, no matter where we come from. And that's also very interesting. Yeah, what would this mean? What is really the knowledge that you and I carry, regardless of where we have been born or our families? How do we explore certain things? How do we experience certain things? What are the common things that we have that really unite us? And again, the other question that you had, how do we communicate? What is this? I mean, yes, we're talking over languages, but then we have body language, and we have the tone of voice and different forms. And if you would be in the same room, I could also smell you. Yeah, I could get different senses from you. And I all find this very, very fascinating. And again, from the SETI aspect also, what could that mean? Let's just think for a moment, regardless of all of the alien movies, but let's say we would really come into a room with a different life form. I just find the idea fascinating. And you would just be there, and then maybe you probably would not understand each other over language, but then you would just find ways to explore each other. And maybe we would start making some music, or maybe we would do some visual information, like in the movie Arrival, where you basically have different kinds of informations. But I just find it so fascinating how different life forms communicate with each other, and that so much information is sometimes missed, because even if we speak the same language, but I'm still missing things from you. I'm not getting everything through the words. Yeah, you have, maybe your mind goes somewhere else, or you have different feelings, or your body is doing something else. So I can just look at you and I can listen to your voice, but there's so much information happening still that is just fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. So I also want to ask you about your activities as a composer and what you're doing, and what should our watchers be aware of that's coming up that you're working on. Music is quite beautiful, by the way. Your music is quite beautiful.
Thank you very much. I mean, what was the awesome thing in the last couple of months was that I had the pleasure of working with numerous scientists on different kinds of pieces. So what you can see behind me is, for example, the sonification of curves. And so what we try to do is figure out a way, how can we have simple curves, and then how can we musicalize them? But we also did a different approach where we just had a piece of mine which was cut in 10 different pieces of music, which is exactly the images that you see behind me. And then I can actually show you this a little bit. Put it a little further, and hopefully you can see some of it. But some of the question then was that we had 8 different people listening to the same kind of music. And so this is always the same music, and then they would paint or draw on an iPad in real time. They would draw curves to the music. And what I found interesting is that, I mean, I'm sure that you have seen the movie Fantasia before, where they basically did visualization of music already many years ago. So that, you know, nothing new that I'm doing. But the interesting part within this project is that we can see people draw different ideas of music at the same time, and then we can actually put them over each other and see, did people experience the music in a similar way? For example, if there was a fast movement, did they have an upwards feeling of trying to paint it? Or here, for example, which is always what I also show my students, you can say, what do these images have in common? And then you, for example, can say, oh, maybe in this case, there's a similar amplitude between all of them. I hope that you can see some of this. And then you can follow these ideas. And then you can also follow other ideas where, for example, you can even see within this structure that they all look quite similar, but then suddenly you have here a change which has a much different kind of drawing. And so this is just some basic ideas that I find fascinating about the connection between visual information and movement, and how it turns into music, and particularly in this way, how different people in real time experience music. And so this was one of the projects that we have been doing. And other projects are, for example, and we are exploring in clinical trials how music can have a specific effect on the body and the mind. And so I have written specific compositions for that as well. One study was to influence the breathing rhythm. And now we're trying to create compositions that have an influence on the mind of patients with delirium, which, for the people that don't know what delirium is, I'm sure that you have had some kind of surgery in your life. And then after the surgery, you wake up and you feel kind of like in this in-between space. You're not really there, you're not really here. And patients with delirium are constantly in this lost space. And it's really life-threatening. And so we're trying to figure out if we can create music and different forms of, literally music on touch. So we have pads that can vibrate, and then they are on the back, there's a speaker on them. And so they can both play the music and then vibrate. And so the patients can touch these pads and then can both hear and feel the music. And we hope, for example, in this case, that we can maybe get them out of these feelings and worlds in different forms. And then these are the kinds of projects that we're doing. Or other projects that we're working on at the DLR is to create soundtracks for certain different tools. So we're trying to find ways of use games, but then have games created in a way where you can actually use them as a learning tool. So like, for example, you can imagine like with car driving. Let's say that you want somebody to teach you to drive in a certain way, for example, to use less gas maybe, and then every time you use too much gas, you get an acoustic trigger. And then you would, for example, know, okay, I'm driving too fast. And so that the acoustic information can help you learn. And that's some of the other projects that we are doing. Then I'm having also a lot of school projects where we're developing different ideas. Like one of them is, I had the idea of creating these sound cubes, which is really like cubes. And then the way that you hold them or that you change these cubes in your hands, they can create different sounds. And then we want them to experience, like especially with young kids, how they might interact with them. And have them both therapeutically, but also pedagogically, and work together with these kinds of things. Then we had projects where we sonified clouds, literally clouds, like cumulus clouds and other forms of clouds. And we're figuring out, could we create an emotional soundtrack for the different kind of types in weather? Is this possible? And so these would be just some of the composition projects that I'm really very excited at the moment, because they just so new and different that it's really interesting first to get the information from the scientists, and then thinking about a way of how can I actually translate it now? What would you need, for example, if I show you different kind of clouds types, how would the music be constructed to help you understand them? yeah, to understand if this is a dangerous cloud, if it's a good cloud, if it's showing that there will be a storm in a second, and so on and so on and so on. And these would be just a few of the composition projects that we have at the moment in the working process.
That's fascinating stuff. It really is. Let me just ask you, I had a question about the visuals that you were showing me behind you. Are they on a vertical line, or are those all done by the same person? Or okay.
Very good question. So if you look from left to right, yeah, so left to right is 10 different movements of one existing piece of mine. So these are all the different 10 movements. And if you look from bottom to top, or whatever way you want, so these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 images, always in these kind of rows, are different people.
Okay.
And so you can see these 8 people have drawn to the same music their visualization of how the music sounds for them. Yeah, and so we are looking now at the moment almost in a kind of C.G. Jung way again. Is there an unconscious experience that we share of how visuals and music work together? And an easy example would be if you look at Fantasia, or even just as a Mickey Mouse movie. Yeah, like imagine there's a cartoon and then Mickey is there and Mickey is walking up a step, and then the music usually makes yeah, so the music goes up, and if she walks down or whoever walks down, then the music makes an upwards kind of movement. And then you have also left to right movement and what we call hit points, which would be, for example, a cut within the movie or a hit point or something else. So these would be traditional ways of how in film you can experience movement. But let me ask this much more difficult question now that I'm also finding fascinating. If you would see a circle, how would you describe this musically? How would you describe a cube? How would you describe a line? How would you describe a dot? And all of that is something that I find interesting because there's actually many applications, both for the feeling of space. For example, one question that is quite interesting, if you think of a whole cube of sound, yeah, so that you have a cube system which you can create sounds within that. You have this area now which is called telemedicine, where you basically can have surgeries from wherever in the world you are as a doctor, and then you can go into the bodies and have the software and the computer task and whatever, and then work on the patients. But sometimes the doctors have said, sometimes it would be great to have some kind of also acoustic information, how deep I am actually in the body if I can't really experience that. So one application could be literally you thinking about this room or your room, and how would the floor sound? How would the top sound? How could the left or the right sound? And so if I again would just use a normal, yeah, form, whatever there is, you could just say, for example, if in each corner I put a different kind of sound in, yeah, like you have 4 corners, then you have, for example, the sound of rain in the left top, and then you have something else in the right top. And so then you could say in this very simple example, if I come closer to any corner, the sound world of that corner would be louder. Yeah, so if I, for example, say the right corner is the sound of birds, and the left corner again would be the sound of rain. And so, for example, then if you would be right in the middle, then you would have a perfect balance of rain and the bird. But if you would now go into one direction, you would hear either more bird or more rain. And so you could really hear on the sound, where am I within that given space? And so then you can also think about, can we do this as a 3D version? And then can you, for example, if you go deep into something, can you, for example, here, am I close to the very end? Am I close to this corner? Am I close to this corner? That would be one application. Another application is that we also have with patients in neurological rehabilitation is that some of them that had severe brain injuries, for example, can't stand straight. So they always feel a little on one side or the other. And So what they usually have, then the physical therapist trying to help them stand straight again, which is a very simple problem, but for them it's quite tricky. And so, for example, now you could use sonification in order to say, if you are like this, then it's basically like a wrong note in some form. So you can say, yeah, so that you can hear as a patient. And the good thing about that is that it's neurologically known that sounds are much better for the brain, especially after bad brain injuries, than spoken language. So the brain can actually understand the sound better than if you just say, stand straight. And on the other hand, if you have these injuries, you also don't know what straight means because your feeling of the space is gone. And this is another way that you could have a very simple example of how you could use sounds and sonification to help you. For example, am I standing straight here in space? Or am I even laying in bed straight? Or am I sitting straight on a chair? Yeah, and so these would be very simple applications of sound walls, sonification, and so on.
Boy, it's fascinating. I remember early in my life, I had a job as a machinist, and one of the jobs I had was working at a company in Newark, New Jersey, and we made a chair that had a screw-like shaft on the bottom, and the whole chair would tilt to the left or tilt to the right very smoothly when that screw-like shaft would rotate. And the idea was that in an experimental setting, someone would sit in a chair in a dark room and they'd have to try to figure out when they were straight up and when they weren't and things like that. So I think
Exactly.
some sonification would have helped, I think.
Exactly, and that's something that I have been thinking as well for astronauts, because they have the same problem sometimes, that they are different in space. And so the example that you just gave us perfect, because that is literally the problem as well. It could help you to understand where you are in space. Yeah, it could, whatever you do, but if it's really on a spaceship, or if it's on ground or whatever, but everything that is, for example, tilted or not tilted could be helped with sonification.
And you also hear stories about airplane pilots, flying into a cloud and flying out the other end of the cloud upside down.
Yes.
Because they had no visual orientation point. It's all very fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Really. Is your work kind of an extension of film music?
Absolutely. In a way, you can say it is a scientific approach to using film scoring. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's not just film scoring, but in a way, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is finding a different way of using the techniques that I'm doing in film scoring and then translating them, because we already know them. That's the cool thing. Yeah. So film scoring is something that everyone understands because we all look movies. Yeah. So I don't need to explain it. And so, yes, I would say in a way, I find it exciting to think, how could we use this now scientifically? How could we use film scoring, creating a soundtrack for science that actually then has both the feeling of it's giving you an emotional impact, but also helping you with the data or the question that you have in front of you. But exactly, yeah, I would say yes. That's a short answer.